What's going on, everyone? This is Eric coming at you from just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. And today we are going to be discussing the history of the Texas Rangers. So, I did intend to do the history of the Baltimore Orioles today, but I've seen to misplace the script for it. So, we're going to do the Rangers today. And there's a good reason for that. When we started off the History of series, the very first video we did was of the Minnesota Twins. And why is that relevant? Well, this is going to be the first AL West team that we're going to do. And the Twins and the Rangers, other than both being AL ball clubs, of course, do share another very interesting part of their history. And we're going to jump right into the video now. So, essentially, if you've seen the history of the Minnesota Twins video, you're aware that the Twins were based in Washington and were named the Washington Senators from 1901 when the league was created until 1960. After the 1960 season, the team left Washington to go to Minnesota. So that left Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, without a baseball team. And obviously, that would not do. So, right off the bat, the city ends up getting a new team. The American League expands, and they say, "Tell you what, Washington's a great city. We need fans. We want to have a hold in the nation's capital. So we're gonna grant Washington D.C. another expansion team. Hope it works out." So what ends up happening is the team obviously goes to Washington, and they are named the Washington Senators to honor the old Washington Senators of the past 60 years. So now we enter the 1960s, and the team would begin playing in the 1961 season. Now, keep in mind, when a team expands, especially in the 1960s, they're not going to have any good players of note. So this team was definitely going to struggle. And they would play their first season at the old Griffith Stadium, which was the stadium that the old Senators, now Minnesota Twins, had played at early on. So, after a rough inaugural season, the team would move from Griffith Stadium to the newly constructed District of Columbia Stadium. Now, the team did not improve much in their second season, once again losing 100 games. Now, unfortunately for any Washington Senators fans, this would continue for another two seasons as the team would average 60 wins and 102 losses over the first 4 years of existence. Really rough start. Now, prior to the 1965 season, the Senators would trade for outfielder Frank Howard. And despite the addition of Howard, the team would continue to struggle. However, they did improve slightly as the decade went on. Now, the Senators had quite a reputation among baseball fans at this point, though. The team was the definition of adequate, below average, and subpar. Just the existence of the Senators in general, including the old Senators. Now, their poor play led to a joke about the team. And this joke, it still kind of stands today. Washington, first in war, first in peace, and still last in the American League. It's a little interesting joke about it. It's not too funny, but it makes, as a history guy, it makes sense. So by 1968, the team was sold for a second time. And this time the team was sold to Bob Short. Now, Bob Short is the man who, at this point, was known for purchasing the Minneapolis Lakers in the 50s and moving the Lakers from Minneapolis to Los Angeles. And that's how he has his infamy. So before the 1969 season, the Senators would hire Hall of Fame outfielder Ted Williams to serve as the team's manager. Now, the team did respond well to the hire, and it had its best season up to that point, going 86 and 76. This was the first time that the second rendition of the Senators finished above 500. So, for the first time, fans in Washington had hope and confidence for their team to actually succeed. Now, obviously, 1960 saw no pennants for the Senators. Now, in 1970, the District of Columbia Stadium was renamed to the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium. And unfortunately, the name change just it didn't help, but it didn't hurt either. But the charm of the 1969 season went away very quickly, unfortunately. The team was in a lot of debt, and owner Bob Short, who was also serving as general manager, had to make some questionable trades. So the team would trade solid players for cheaper ones and cash. Very unfortunate at this time in baseball history. So one of these trades was saw Washington trade three of their players, which essentially was three starters: their stars, starting pitcher, as well as their starting shortstop and third baseman, to Detroit in exchange for starting pitcher Denny McLain, who had spent most of the 1970 season suspended for his alleged involvement in illegal gambling. So McLean would only spend one season in Washington, losing a major league high 22 games before being traded away again, this time for complete no names. So Detroit, on the other hand, became a contender once more with their newly acquired starters. So after the 1970 season, Bob Short informed the city of Washington that unless somebody would purchase the Senators for $12 million, which would be roughly 80 million today, he would not renew the lease on the stadium and the team would relocate. Now, why does that matter? This was never going to happen. And obviously the team stunk. But by comparison, in 1973, so around this time, the Yankees, okay, this is the New York Yankees, the biggest team in baseball, sold for only $8.8 million. He wanted more money than the Yankees were worth. Obviously, that was never going to happen. So, at the conclusion of the 1971 season, another rough one on the field for the team, the Senators announced their intention to move to Arlington, Texas. So the American League would approve the move 10 votes to 2. The last game of the 1971 season was memorable to say the least. Now, it was memorable for all the wrong reasons. So the Senators fan base was obviously irate about the team moving away. You know, this is the second time in 12 years that they had a team leave. Obviously, they're not happy about that. And many of fans had snuck into the stadium after the first pitch because security guards just didn't care. They're like, you know what? I'm out of a job after today. What do I care? So they would walk away. There was too many people. They're just like, what do I care? You know, I got paid. I'm not playing for my job. I'm not here for my job. So what do I care? So this would lead to a larger crowd with a lack of security. You can see where this is going. And by the ninth inning, the Senators were actually winning the game 7-5. Now, with two outs, fans would begin to storm the field. The lack of security made it next to impossible to stop the fans from storming the field because obviously one goes, herd mentality kicks in, and his friend goes, and his friend goes, and then random people across the way say, hey, look, there's three guys on the field. Let me go. Let's meet up with them. And then all of a sudden you have 100 people storming the field. You can't stop that. So one fan actually managed to steal first base while others would just tear up small pieces of grass and take dirt from the infield and the pitcher's mound, of course. So the crew chief had to call the game in favor of the visiting team, who was the New York Yankees. And with that, the Senators were no more. Now, obviously, that's not a good way to end your time in a city, but the fans did it, and the fans were the ones who cost them the game. But life goes on. So now the team is officially based in Texas. We're going into 1972 now. And they would choose the nickname Rangers to pay tribute to the state's law enforcement agency of the same name, the Texas Rangers. And they would play their home games in Arlington Stadium. So the team's first season in Texas did not go that well, and the team would lose 100 games yet again. In response, they would trade away outfielder Frank Howard, and manager Ted Williams would retire. They didn't want to fire Ted, but he just retired. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. So he was replaced by Whitey Herzog, who surprisingly was canned after only one season and himself was replaced by Mr. Always Cut Billy Martin. And this move was very controversial as Bob Short had allegedly told former manager Whitey Herzog that he would, quote, fire his own grandmother for a chance to hire Billy Martin, end quote. Obviously, this didn't sit well when that became public. Now, in May of 1974, Bob Short would sell the Rangers. And during the 1974 season, catcher Jim Sudberg would debut for the team. Now, the team did have a decent 74 season, finishing 84 and 76. To date, they are the only team in MLB history to follow up a pair of 100 plus lost seasons with a season above 500. Interesting little tidbit there. And before the 1975 season, Texas would trade for starting pitcher Gaylord Perry. Now, the 1975 season was not as kind to the Rangers as the 74 one was, and Texas management was fed up with Billy Martin, and they proceeded to fire him in July. So, after an average 1976, the team would begin to produce. Now, after the 77 season, Gaylord Perry was traded away, and they would finish second in the American League West in 1977 and 1978. Now, prior to the 1979 season, the Rangers would acquire third baseman Buddy Bell. The team would fall to third in the AL West, but the future was looking bright again as the decade drew to a close for the organization. No pennants won in the 1970s. So now we get to 1980. And before the 1980 season, knuckerballer Charlie Hoff was acquired. And the team would struggle, hanging around 500, but they were not good enough to get over the 500 mark, which of course hurts. In the beginning, the beginning to middle of the decade, weren't too kind. But as the success for the team began to fade off the field, the attendance did as well. This was in part due to the heat of the area. So the extreme heat was a real problem for the Rangers. Now, around this time, Ted Williams made it public that part of the reason he resigned as manager was due to the extreme heat of Texas. Remember, it's an outdoor stadium in Texas. Not exactly ideal. So the temperature would constantly top 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty hot, and it's dry heat. There's no shade, none of that. Now this would lead to the Rangers having to play more night games than they wanted to, but it did lead to attendance numbers slowly going back up as people could start to stomach it because when it's not the sun's not beating down on you, it's a little easier to sit outside. So following up the 1983 season, fan favorite Jim Sundberg was traded away. And during the summer of 1985, third baseman Buddy Bell was traded away. The team would also hire manager Bobby Valentine around this time. Now, the 1986 season went much better than expected, and the team finished second in the American League West, going 87 and 75. However, the rest of the decade saw the team drop back down to being a 500 ball club once more. Prior to the 1989 season, however, the Rangers made a big move when they would sign free agent starting pitcher Nolan Ryan to a deal. In April of 1989, a group of investors, headlined by future President George W. Bush, would purchase the Texas Rangers. And during the season, outfielder Juan Gonzalez and pitcher Kenny Rogers would make their debuts for the ball club. As the decade drew to a close, for the third time in their 3 decades of existence, the Rangers would have hope. No pennants won in the 1980s. So now we get to the 90s. And the Rangers had a solid 1990 season, but finished a distant third in the American League West. This was due to the Oakland Athletics just being extremely, extremely good at that time. So Charlie Hoff would leave the team after the 1990 season. On the flip side, in 1991, catcher Ivan Rodriguez would make his debut. Now, the team would remain competitive through 1991, but would struggle in 1992. This would lead to Bobby Valentine being fired midway through the 92 season. After the 93 season, Nolan Ryan would officially retire. Now, the Rangers would move to the newly constructed ballpark in Arlington for the 1994 season. Now, this is a big what if. So, we all know the what if of the Montreal Expos in the 94 season. They had a very good season, and then the player strike kicks in. A lot of teams that you wouldn't expect to do good were doing good. The Yankees were doing good in 94. Keep in mind, the Yankees weren't that great in the 90s, in the early 90s, I should say. So what if, maybe we could have seen Mattingly, but the Rangers actually led the American League West before the player strike prematurely ended the 1994 season. So, had this continued, the team obviously would have clinched its first ever postseason berth, but the player strike said no to that. And the players and fans were stuck waiting, but ownership would see some change after that as George W. Bush had gone on to become the governor of Texas. Obviously, he had to sell his stake in the ball club, and Johnny Oates would end up getting hired as manager of the club. So, following the 1995 season, Kenny Rogers, the pitcher, would leave the team. He would return for two separate stints in the early to mid 2000s. I just didn't want to print those out. So the Rangers would finally make the playoffs for the first time in 1996. However, the team was knocked out in the American League Divisional Series, ALDS. After an off year in 97, the team would return to the playoffs in both 98 and 99. Both times, however, they would get swept by the eventual World Series champion New York Yankees. Following the 1999 season, outfielder Juan Gonzalez was traded to Detroit. On the bright side, attendance numbers were up and fans had excitement for the fourth time as a decade drew to a close. No pennants won in the 1990s. Now, towards the end of the 2000 season, the Rangers would acquire infielder Michael Young. Michael Young was a great player. We did do a trade breakdown video on Michael Young. Check it out if you haven't already. If you haven't seen it, it's an older trade, but it's a good one. Really helped out the Rangers. So the first season of the new century was not too kind to the Rangers, and the team would finish last in the AL West. Now, this led to the club committing a ton of money to a free agent shortstop named Alex Rodriguez. Now, he signs a massive 10-year, $252 million contract. At this point in time, that's not insane to hear of, but at that point in 2000, that's gigantic. Biggest contract in baseball by far, no questions asked. So, how does that end up panning out for him? Well, A-Rod did good, but the Rangers would struggle to open the 2001 season. As a result, Johnny Oates would resign as manager. Juan Gonzalez did return to the team prior to the 2002 season. However, Ivan Rodriguez would walk as a free agent. Even though A-Rod was still excelling, the rest of the roster was lacking. So, for the 2003 season, the team would hire manager Buck Showalter, who's known for his work with young players. Now, first baseman Mark Teixeira would debut in 2003. After yet another disappointing season in 2003, the team decided that they needed cap space more than they needed Alex Rodriguez. So they would flip him to the New York Yankees. Now, this trade, again, has been discussed in the trade breakdown series. So definitely check that one out if you haven't seen it already. Again, a very interesting trade with a little bit of a twist that really could have saved the Rangers. They could have picked a good player, but instead they went with a guy that nobody really knows. So joining A-Rod on the way out was outfielder Juan Gonzalez, who was allowed to walk with the club from the club as the team was looking towards a youth movement. So in May of 2004, the stadium was renamed to AmeriQuest Field in Arlington. Now the Rangers had a good 2004 season, but finished third in a very close AL West race. So, following a rough 2005 season that saw the team's pitching staff get decimated by injury, the team decided to invest in pitchers more than hitters. Now, Unfortunately for them, the contracts that they gave in free agency just didn't work out. So the team was still saw good pitching, but it wasn't great. In 2006, second baseman Ian Kinsler would make his MLB debut, and in July of the same year, the team would trade for outfielder Nelson Cruz. Again, trade breakdown. I don't want to sound like broken record. Videos up. Definitely check that one out if you haven't already. Nelson Cruz trade breakdown. So what ends up happening though is after the 2006 season, Buck Showalter gets canned as manager of the Rangers. Now the club would hire Ron Washington as his replacement. So the team stadium was once more renamed, this time to Rangers Ballpark in Arlington. In July of 2007, first baseman Mark Teixeira was traded away. Broken record, I know. Check out the trade breakdown if you haven't seen it already. So, this was one of the only moves that Texas would make in 2007 as the team was dealing with numerous financial problems and was looking towards the future rather than trying to win today. So, interesting moment for the Rangers here. On August 22nd, 2007, the Rangers would set an MLB record by scoring 30 runs in a win against Baltimore Orioles. I remember this game. So the team also set a major league record for a margin of victory with 27 runs as they won that game 30-3. The Rangers would acquire outfielder Josh Hamilton prior to the 2008 season, and catcher Ivan Rodriguez would return for the 2009 season, but he would leave after it ended. On the bright side, shortstop Elvis Andrus would debut for the team during the 2009 season. Now, the Rangers started off 2009 with a strong push, but injuries really slowed them down and kept them out of the playoffs. Once more, the Rangers had a bright outlook as the decade came to a close. No pennants won in the 2000s, however. But that would change really quick. So, starting off in 2010, a familiar face came back in the organization. Nolan Ryan, who had been serving as the team's president, along with other investors, would purchase the Texas Rangers in January of 2010. So this sale would take time, however, due to various debts owed by the original owner of the team. And despite the off the field drama, the Rangers would excel on the field. They had signed free agent outfielder Vladimir Guerrero to a 1 year deal. Nolan Ryan had high hopes for the Rangers in 2010. When he was asked about the upcoming season in January, he said, quote, "My expectations today are that we're going to be extremely competitive, and if we don't win our division, I'll be disappointed," end quote. High things coming from a Hall of Fame player. So in the summer of 2010, the Rangers would trade for starting pitcher Cliff Lee. The Rangers had a very successful 2010 season and would win the American League West. Now, they managed to defeat the Rays in the ALDS, marking the club's first ever playoff series victory. They were matched up against the defending champion New York Yankees in the American League CS Championship Series, ALCS. So they had a chance to avenge themselves from the 90s against these Yankees. Did they do it? Yes, they did. They managed to beat the Yankees, marking their first tickets, marking their first trip to the World Series, and they had some hope. They met up with the San Francisco Giants and would lose that series 4 games to 1. Following the 2010 season, Cliff Lee would leave the team in free agency, but despite the loss of the ace, the team still had high expectations. They would sign free agent third baseman Adrian Beltre. And the team actually ended up doing better in 2011 than they did in 2010, at least regular season wise, and again made their way through the American League en route to another AL pennant, their second in history. Now, they would meet up with the St. Louis Cardinals in this World Series, and they would make it to a game seven. Now, this game seven was a very interesting one, and the Cardinals took it, sending the Rangers home with a second consecutive World Series loss. This time, they at least made it to a game seven. A lot of people were very upset for the Rangers, but it is what it is at this point. So, the Rangers facing new competition from within the division at this point, as the Angels decided to make a lot of moves, including signing Albert Pujols. they decided to sign free agent starting pitcher from Japan, Yu Darvish. Now, the team had a good 2012 season, but lost in the wild card playing round. Michael Young was traded after the 2012 season, and Josh Hamilton would leave the team via free agency. With key players leaving, the Rangers end up missing the playoffs in 2013. And this was via a game 163, which we mentioned before in the Minnesota Twins history series, which is essentially two teams have the same record and they play a game 163 to see who makes the playoffs and who does not. So Nelson Cruz would walk after the 2013 season after a performance enhancing drug suspension would sour his relationship with the management. The Rangers also would attempt to trade for a big power bat, trading away fan favorite second baseman Ian Kinsler to the rival Detroit Tigers. At this point, these two teams were the top teams in the American League in exchange for first baseman designated hitter Prince Fielder. So before the 2014 season, the stadium once more is renamed to Globe Life Park in Arlington. Now, the Rangers had an uncharacteristically bad season in 2014. Now, this led to Ron Washington resigning at the end of the season. In April of 2015, the Rangers would reacquire Josh Hamilton, but he dealt with numerous injuries and just didn't pan out. He wasn't the same player as before. He ends up getting released in 2017. Now, in 2015, the Rangers would make a big trade at the trade deadline, acquiring starting pitcher Cole Hamels from the Phillies. And the addition of Hamels really helped turn the team around. It showed that they had confidence in their young team. And they actually end up winning the AL West. Now, this matched them up with the Blue Jays in the ALDS. Now, this is one of the most memorable playoff series, definitely in my lifetime. And this is the one that was made famous for Jose Bautista's infamous bat flip. Definitely check that video out if you haven't seen it already. A lot of YouTubers cover this ALDS, created an amazing rivalry, and of course would end up leading to future beef between the two teams, the Blue Jays and the Rangers. So 2016 would start off well for the team, but in July, Prince Fielder would suffer a neck injury. Now, the next month, Fielder essentially announced that he could no longer play professional baseball. Despite the loss of their first baseman designated hitter, the team went on to have their best record in the American League. However, they were swept in a shocking fashion in the ALDS by the wild card Toronto Blue Jays. Their rivals come back to bite them once more. In July of 2017, with the Rangers clearly on the downswing, they would trade away starting pitcher Yu Darvish. The Rangers would suffer a pair of down seasons at this point, and following the 2018 season, Adrian Beltre would retire. The 2019 season saw the Rangers clearly going into a rebuild mode where they still sit today. Now, in the 2010s, the Rangers won 2 AL pennants but lost both trips to the World Series. Now, in the 2020s, obviously, we've only had one season. And the team would move to the newly built Globe Life Field prior to the 2020 season. Now, the team had a horrible season in 2020, finishing last in a very weak AL West. Makes you wonder how they would have done in a more competitive division like the NL East, AL East, but neither here nor there. So on the bright side, their stadium was showed on national TV as Globe Life Field was the host of the 2020 World Series due to, as we know, the coronavirus pandemic. So the Rangers have won 2 AL pennants in their history, but have not won a single World Series. 11 people with ties to the Rangers organization are enshrined in the Cooperstown Hall of Fame. Now, last thing we got to say is they have 6 retired numbers. Number 7, Ivan Rodriguez. Number 10, Michael Young. Number 26, Johnny Oates. Number 29, Adrian Beltre. Number 34, Nolan Ryan. And number 42, retired league-wide, Jackie Robinson. That number very well might go up in a little bit. We might see players like Corey Kluber get his number retired in the future. It's possible. I don't know if he had a long enough peak for the team to really consider it. But again, the Rangers have had a very interesting history. So, real quick recap. Basically, they start off as an expansion team in Washington in 1961, stepping in for the team that had just left Washington, naming themselves as the Senators. And they did okay. They were good, but never good enough to actually be competitive. They would leave the city following 1972, where they would move to Texas. And the extreme heat of Texas ended up affecting attendance numbers, leading to Ted Williams' resignation. And poor play also led to that. But a lot of interesting owners have had the Rangers through the years, but the team never really stepped out during their ownerships, particularly George W. Bush's in the late 80s into early 90s. But the team did have a nice run in the late 90s before falling to the Yankees dynasty both times in the playoffs. And then in the 2000s, the team really started clicking. Towards the end of that decade, they started doing much better. Nolan Ryan would purchase share in the team in 2010, early 2010, and the team would go on to win two consecutive AL pennants, 2010, 2011. However, they did not win the World Series, losing the Giants and Cardinals, respectively, in 5 and 7 games, respectively. So that's where we are with the Rangers. They're in a rebuild right now, so good luck if you're a Rangers fan. Trust me, rebuilds stink, I know. They did recently just trade starting pitcher Lance Lynn to the Chicago White Sox for what's his name? Dane Dunning. So Dunning's a very good, young, talented pitcher. I definitely like Dunning a lot. So I think you guys are going to really have a good young pitcher on your hands. Good luck if you're a Rangers fan. This was the history of the Texas Rangers. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, definitely make sure to leave a like. Appreciate it. Definitely make sure to leave any comments. I know early on I had to mute myself for a couple seconds there. I randomly had a coughing fit. I do apologize for that. But again, hope you guys enjoyed this. It was history of the Texas Rangers. The next one will hopefully be coming up in a week. Be the history of the Baltimore Orioles. Have a great rest of your day.